I'd like to just start with these words from the Buddhist Pali Canon. If you have little, give a little. If you have a middling amount, give a middling amount. If you have much, give much. It is not fitting to not give at all. So, as with other religions, generosity is really important in the Buddhist practice. It's actually considered a foundational practice. When the Buddha taught newcomers, he always started with generosity as the first thing he taught. And the idea was that you couldn't have a true spiritual life unless you had a generous heart. I read about a monk in the Theravadan Buddhist tradition who believes that, or who said that if someone doesn't understand the value of basic generosity, then you're not even teachable yet. So starting with generosity was one way to sort of get people to be teachable, sort of open them up. So today I'm going to talk about why generosity is important and some of the things that the Buddha said about it. So what's so important about generosity? Well, it can be an antidote to greed. And in the Buddhist tradition, we talk about there's 3 poisons: greed, hate, and delusion. And so giving or generosity is one antidote to greed. It's one way that sort of lets us be not as self-centered, lets us not be so grasping about things, both externally, physical, material things, but also internally about the way things are. One Buddhist, you might have heard of her, Sharon Salzberg, has said that the movement of the heart in practicing generosity mirrors the movement of the heart that lets go inside. So the external training of giving deeply influences the internal feeling tone of the meditation practice, or I would say your spiritual practice, and vice versa. She says, if we cultivate a generous heart, then more and more we can unconditionally allow things to be the way they are. We can accept the truth of the present moment rather than continually impose conditions on what's going on. So giving helps release our attachments. It just sort of creates some space, some expansiveness in our lives and in our hearts. And giving feels good. One Buddhist scripture says, one should train in 3 deeds of merit: generosity, a balanced life, developing a loving mind, and that these yield long-lasting happiness. And psychological science backs up this idea that giving makes you happy. I want to tell you about a Canadian story. So I'm a psychologist, you heard in the intro. So I love this stuff. There was a Canadian study, and what they did was that they found people on probably a mall of campus or something in the morning, and they asked them questions about themselves, one question being, how happy are you right now? So they had that measure. And then they gave them one of 4 envelopes. And inside the envelope, there was either $5 or $20, and there was an instruction. And the instruction was either spend this money on yourself, like pay a bill or get yourself a coffee, or spend this money on someone else or to a charity you like. But you have to do it by 5 p.m. And then at 5 p.m., they contacted the people again and followed up. And what they found was that people who spent the money on other people were happier, had a level of happiness more than the other people who spent it on themselves. And the amount that they gave didn't matter. So if you gave $20 or $5, it didn't make a difference you weren't happier if you gave more. It was just the amount, it was just the giving rather than the amount that made a difference. Other research too has shown that giving can have physiological benefits. So it's been correlated with reduced blood pressure, with lower heart disease, with better sleep, possibly with longer lifespans. But the kicker is that if you give for self-motivated reasons, like you're wanting something out of your giving, then you don't really get those benefits. So altruistic giving is really what kind of gives you some benefit from it. And the Buddha kind of predicted this. He actually had some lists about motivations or reasons for giving and ways of giving. And I'm not going to read you the list, I'm just going to kind of summarize some of those things. Basically, it kind of gets down to being aware of our motives, why we are giving, and also noticing our experience when we are giving. So, being aware of our motives for giving. Why are we moved to give? Sometimes, and this sounded kind of weird to me when I thought about it, but sometimes we give out of fear or shame. Like we might be worried what others will think of us if we don't give. Like if you've ever been in an office pool or something and everyone's chipping in for something, you might feel sort of obligated to chip in. You might be embarrassed if what might people think if I don't chip in. So just that shame or fear. We might give because we feel expected to, or because we've been taught to give, because our family has always given to this place, we are going to give to this place. So just sort of being conditioned to give. We might give because someone gave to us, so that feeling of having to reciprocate. I don't know if this has ever happened to you around the holidays, but someone gives you a gift and they weren't on your radar of people you might want to give to, and then you're sort of like, feeling like you need to give back to them. And sometimes we give just because intellectually we think it's a good idea. It fits in with a political philosophy. We think service is a value that we love, so it's just a good idea to us, we think. So it's more intellectual. Sometimes people give to enhance their reputation. I hadn't really thought about that, but a nonprofit that I work with just recently launched a capital campaign, and the board had to make a decision about whether we would accept gifts from people who were political candidates. Like, oh yeah, people might give just because they're a political candidate to enhance their reputation. And then finally, the Buddha described giving to ennoble the mind. And I think what we're getting back to here is that process of trying to open us up to get rid of some of our conditioning and to try to alleviate that greed that clings to us a lot of times. So giving out of loving kindness, giving out of concern for others, those are all ways of ennobling the mind, but also being aware of giving as part of our spiritual practice. I read a story about a meditation teacher who goes to a meditation center and was giving some workshops on generosity. And she asked the volunteers, like, well, you know, what do you think of your volunteer work in terms of your spiritual practice? And they thought they really had disconnected it. They hadn't considered their volunteering as part of their spiritual practice, which she thought was really interesting. Like they felt like it was just sort of practical, they were there, it was needed, but they hadn't considered it part of their practice. So that's part of, I think this last thing is ennobling the mind. It's also part of your spirituality, your spiritual practice. I want to just touch briefly that some of these motives for giving are also motives for not giving, especially fear. Sometimes we're worried we don't have enough if it's a monetary gift, or maybe we don't think we are enough if we want to comfort someone and we may not think we know how to do that. And we might be scared of that. So just fear as a motive for not giving can come up as well. Or even just fear in terms of, or sorry, not fear, but not giving in terms of it's just a habit to not do it or to not think about it. And then this one is interesting, I think, not giving if we feel like it hasn't been appreciated enough. And that's sort of related to that enhanced reputation one. So being aware of our motives for giving is an important part of the process of generosity, but noticing the experience is also important. Buddhism is an embodied practice. We're constantly reminded to try to be aware of what we are experiencing. But sometimes, I know for me it's really easy to get in my head and kind of forget about that part. So just how are we giving? Are we giving out of affection or love? It can be really easy to give gifts to your children or your grandchildren because you have so much love for them. Are we giving begrudgingly, like out of anger or annoyance? Somebody keeps pestering you and you're like, fine, take it. You know, like you can give that way. So just being aware when that happens. Again, are we giving sort of like, is it just sort of a habit or is it all in our heads? And I fall prey to this one. I know that for some of the nonprofits, I signed up for automatic monthly giving, and then it's like, check, that's done, don't have to worry about it anymore, don't think about it anymore. So that's like an opportunity that I'm losing, really. I think many of us probably experience that. We know that it's important to give your time and energy and support, but we don't often like take the moment to experience how it feels when we do that. I wanted to tell you this story that happened to me last week, but I needed another sip of tea first. Last weekend, my husband changed out our snow tires on the car. or at least he tried to. He got 3 of them off, and the 4th tire, the lug nuts were frozen and wouldn't come off. So last Tuesday, I dropped the car off at Tire-Rama, which is swamped as with every other tire place in town, right? But because this was a mechanical issue and not just a swapping out tires issue, they could get me in. So yeah, it was great. So in the afternoon, I go there to pick up the car, but they hadn't got the parts for it yet, and so I ended up waiting there, and I decided to work on this talk, actually. So I'm working on this talk, and a woman comes in with 2 pizzas to give to the Tire-Rama guys. Yeah, it was very sweet. They were super surprised. They were really excited. And I thought, what synchronicity this is that I'm working on a talk about giving, and this woman comes in. So I ended up talking to her afterward, after she'd talked to the clerk, the person behind the register. And I said, I'm giving this talk, and you came in, and could I use you as an example? And what motivated you to give the pizzas today? And she actually got teary. I'm probably going to get teary thinking about it. She got teary, and she said, this is our only car. We have really young kids. It's really important for us to have safe transportation. And these guys were the only ones who could get us in because everybody else is swamped in town. And she was so grateful. And I could just feel her heart, and how she was feeling her gratitude and her giving. I'm like, see, it really touched me. It was very moving. And I think this is how giving becomes a spiritual practice. It touches our hearts, and it touches other people's hearts. It opens us up. It creates a softness and tenderness. We feel connected to each other, thinking about the welfare of others. And so it's important not to get sort of caught up in the motions of giving and forgetting about that experience of giving. I have one more example I wanted to share, which was a few weeks ago I was at a meditation retreat. And at the end of these retreats, there's often a dana talk. Dana is the Pali word we use in Buddhism for giving. And there's a talk to please, support the teacher. So at the end of the retreat, we were listening to the dana talk, and the teacher spoke about how this is really his only income, that he doesn't have a traditional job, it's just sharing the Dharma, and how important it is for him to give support. And then the retreat director talked about that awkwardness of how do you know how much to give? What's the appropriate amount? And she talked about this process that she suggests, that first you go to your head and you think about a number. And usually your head is going to think about, it's kind of that fear part, all the reasons you shouldn't give very much. So your number is probably going to be over here on the low side. And then she suggested going to our hearts and thinking about a number. And that side is probably going to go on to this side. You want to give so much. We appreciated the teaching so much. And then she suggested, seeing those 2 numbers and then weighing in with your gut and seeing what the gut says. And that's probably going to be a little more realistic and a little more in the middle. And you might stretch a little, but it's not going to break your bank. But I love this process because part of what she's doing is having us check in with our whole self and really experience with our whole self how we're feeling about the giving process. So I just wanted to share that. Almost lastly, I promise. I read an article on generosity by Gloria Taranaya Ambrosia. And she reminds us that this process is a practice. It's a practice about learning from the giving and the holding back, to see for ourselves which feels best, to learn the subtle attachments that cause us to hold back or to think only of ourselves, and to know the release of letting go. And part of the reason I wanted to bring up that this is a learning process is I think that we can really get down on ourselves sometimes and very judgmental about either how we give or how much we can give, or if we've forgotten to check in with ourselves, or if we don't think we have the right motivations. But it's a learning process, and it's a practice. In the Zen tradition, the practice is not about the giver and who's receiving the gift and the gift itself. It's about the act of giving. And so that's maybe the action that matters the most, the act of giving. And I'm just going to say that part of that act would be, if you can remember, to check in about your motives and to check in about how it feels. And then I just want to bring us back full circle, that this practice of generosity is one that the Buddha suggested should fill us with joy. So we should find joy when we form the intention to give, and joy in the act of giving itself, and then joy when we remember that we have given. And I want to just speak a little bit to that last one, because I think the first two feel pretty obvious. But the last one sort of feels like, well, I'm like just trying to puff myself up about look at all that I've given. And it's not about that, but it's all too easy to sort of get down on ourselves for our mistakes or for that sort of thing. So it's nice to just remember that of all the choices we have during the day, when we've remembered to give, and when we've remembered to give either financial support or energy or time or attention, perhaps the most important gift you can give, like just to remember that you are doing good in the world and that it touches not only other people, but it comes back and touches yourself so that you can open your heart and other hearts as well. Thanks.